Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another Breakfast with Blaha. And today we're going to talk a little bit about fat loss. And I want to start this topic off on an important point. And I've said this before, and I will say it again. A lot of people, and this is going to insult some of you who've been in the comments, I'm going to insult you politely. When you give a general rule that's a good piece of useful advice, you get people who like to jump in and try to come up with exceptions to this rule. Usually really extreme exceptions that you are unlikely to run into as a coach, that you personally listening, getting this advice are unlikely to run into, is a way to insert their own intellect and say, hey, look how smart I am. I found an exception to this really, really good rule or really good piece of advice that you gave that will be perfect advice for 95 or 99% of people listening. I found an exception, and they think that it makes them clever. Actually, it displays that you're not that intelligent. And I hate to have to tell you that, but if you're the person who does that, you're not really as smart as you think you are. You really aren't. It actually displays that you don't understand the reason that advice was given. You don't understand it in a real world context. You don't understand it from a pragmatic perspective. You're actually not that intelligent. And you're displaying for everybody looking that you're not that smart. And everyone who understands the advice with real experience realizes you're kind of a dumbass. And that's the reality of it. And I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just stating it so that people who do that realize it makes you look dumb. And you're giving bad advice on top of it. Again, this is not intended to be an academic debate when we're teaching people how to get results with different things that we do or discussing this minutia. It's intended to be teaching. It's not intended to be an academic debate. And while it might be true that there might be exceptions, your exceptions may not actually be true. And this is one of those cases. And people come in and try to say, well, there are cases where a person could gain fat in a calorie deficit. Really, this has never happened. This does not happen. When we look at it in a metabolic ward, or even go look at the Minnesota starvation experiment, humans lose fat the entire time they're in a deficit. If you were to go check with DEXA scans and MRIs and things, and you keep them in a deficit, no matter how big or how small, their body fat amount will go down every single week, no matter what you get wrong, no matter what other factors mess up. People will say stuff like, well, what if they're losing a lot of muscle? Okay, if you're losing a lot of muscle on the same deficit because you're eating a bad diet that doesn't support training and recovery, your protein's really low, you lose a little less fat because you're using more muscle for fuel. You still lose fat. Okay, another exception, someone tried to say, well, that's not true. You don't always lose fat in a deficit, because when someone takes a bunch of gear, a bunch of steroids, right? Take a bunch of roids, and they come off of all of them and they start losing muscle, they'll gain fat even in a small calorie deficit. No, they don't. No, they don't. Now, someone might say, yeah, but if you go put them in a DEXA scan, their body fat percentage will go up. Okay. But let's come back over and think about that. All right. Because you lost a large chunk of lean mass in your body without losing very much fat, because again, that's what's going to happen in that case. All right. If you have been put into a very catabolic state for any reason, such as, let's say you eat almost no protein in your deficit, or you're on a very large calorie deficit, right? Your body's going to be more biased towards burning off muscle for fuel. You're still possibly losing some fat. And in the case of this, they're in a small deficit and they're shedding muscle tissue like crazy, because they've used really high doses of stuff and came off, and let's say over a little period of time, they're in a small deficit, they lose 20 pounds of muscle tissue, right? And you go look at the DEXA scan and go, aha, their body fat percentage went from 15% to 17%. They gained fat. No, they didn't gain any fat. The amount of fat on their body did not increase. Their percentage did, because they lost a large chunk of the non-fat percentage. So if they only lost 3 ounces of fat to go with the 20 pounds of muscle, even though they lost fat, their body fat percentage, because it was so massively skewed, did go up. But they didn't gain any body fat. And I've got a friend who's a coach, and she's tried to argue this on DEXA scans. For example, it's why DEXA scans don't work, because she did one and intentionally did her best to cheat it. She got really dehydrated, like she dropped a bunch of water weight, right? And her muscle tissue went way down, and she's like, aha, so my DEXA scan, my body fat percentage went up slightly. I was able to skew it. It's like, okay, stop and think about that from a practical perspective. Because you did something that you would never ever want to do if you're trying to accurately measure your body composition. And it didn't inaccurately measure it. It measured the fact that you lost 16 pounds of intramuscular water weight, so therefore you had 16 pounds less lean tissue because you intentionally did this. The DEXA scan accurately tracked that. Since you dropped and dehydrated 16 pounds of water weight out of your lean tissue, it reads that you have less lean tissue. Okay. It's still accurate. And for tracking purposes, if your goal was to, if you were serious and you were spending money on something like a DEXA scan, you were spending money on a DEXA scan so that you could track your progress, and you intentionally do something extreme to try to skew it, you threw your money away, and you intentionally said, I have a pretty good tool that's useful for gathering data, so I'm going to try to ruin the data so that I don't have good data to work for that I just paid $100 to have the scan for, right? That's not good. That's being wasteful, saying I can find a way to cheat the thing. Okay, well, are any of your clients going to do that? Are you going to tell your clients to go do that when you have them do DEXA scans as a coach, and if they can afford them and they want them so that you can track their progress? I would hope not. So how is this practical? It's not. It's not useful. Took a really good tool and found a way to skew it, but it's the same sort of skewing that we get if someone drops a very large amount of muscle, such as the extreme scenario that the person presented. Okay. But they didn't gain body fat. And you don't have evidence of this, right? I'm not talking about skin folds. When you actually have reasonably accurate measurements, such as they're doing MRIs or DEXA scans, your body fat amount is not going to go up in a deficit. Even if your composition changes negatively, you didn't stop losing body fat. Okay, you didn't stop losing body fat. You just lost muscle. And I'm not saying that a calorie deficit done incorrectly can't burn muscle. We know it can. There are plenty of cases where improperly done training and diet can cause half of the weight that you lose to be muscle tissue, right? You can do that. It's bad. It's not good. It's not useful. It's counterproductive. But it can be done. It's pretty common, actually. More common than you would think. I'd say probably a third of people trying to lose weight do stuff bad enough to make that happen. But they didn't stop losing body fat. They still lost fat. And all the studies are pretty consistent showing that. We know this is what happens in people. So there aren't exceptions to this rule, no matter how extreme people try to come up with things to make them exceptions. And that includes a bad diet. We know that even if you live on junk food and you're in a calorie deficit, you still lose body fat. It happens based on the calorie basis, right? And it's been studied. We know it happens. It's been demonstrated. It's not the best way to do it. I wouldn't recommend you do it this way. I don't think it's good advice, but you would still lose body fat. And I've seen that try to be used as an exception too. Well, if someone eats a bunch of junk food and they're in a deficit, no, they'll lose body fat based on the deficit still. They're at a higher risk of muscle tissue loss or at a higher risk of feeling like crap. Okay, it's not good, but they'll still lose fat. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.